my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
I have a dream. My poor little children one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their
Don't
character.
tell me words don't matter. I have a dream. Just words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Just words. We have nothing to fear but fear itself. Just words. Just speeches. Don't tell me words don't matter.
All the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all sight shall see it.
Good evening, class. I'm sure most of you are aware of the current debt crisis our country is now facing, but that is not something new to the United States. Our country was borrowing money before it declared independence, and is still borrowing money today. What I'm going to do in my speech is take you for a train ride all the way back to our first experience with debt that dates back to before the Revolutionary War. I'm going to make a few important stops throughout our history, one being in 1835 when we conquered national debt, and another after World War II when we took a little bit more radical look on government spending. We're then going to ride throughout the rest of the 20th century and make one final stop in 2012. Now, before you can board this debt train, there's a few basic things that you need to know. One is deficit spending, which is basically spending more than your income. If you go to the store with $20 and spend $30, then you got deficit spending. Debt. Debt is the amount you borrow to now owe with interest. And the more your debt grows, the higher your interest payment is. 3% of 20 is more than 3% of 10. Now, GDP, or gross domestic product, is the market value of all the officially recognized final goods and services produced within a country within a given period. If the GDP is $1 and the national debt is $1, then the GDP is 100% of the national debt. All right, now let's make our first stop in 1776 after the Revolutionary War. After the war, our country was $86 million in debt. $86 million in debt in 1776. 21 million of which was state, 54 million of what was national, and 11 million in foreign. One of the problems that our states had is that they printed their own money, and that this created a controversy over how much each individual state's currency was actually worth. So how we fixed this is we created the first U.S. central bank, which was conceived by Alexander Hamilton to help handle the colossal war debt and create a standard form of currency. Another thing that the bank did to handle the debt was they printed continentals, which is essentially a bond that the people were supposed to be able to obtain anytime they wanted, but the banks overborrowed and often couldn't pay back these debts. So the term, as worthless as a continental, became common amongst the people deciding to pay the debts. Our founding fathers were actually faced with the decision on whether we should actually even pay our debts or just wipe the slate clean. If they would have defaulted on their debts, then they would have had no credit and probably never would have been able to borrow money. So ultimately they decided to pay the debts. Now another question they had to ask themselves is how do we pay the debt and how fast do we pay the debt? And this is where Adam Smith, who I like to refer to as the father of economics, comes in. Adam Smith didn't believe in the government control of economics. And one way, he believed in an invisible hand in economics. And one way my teacher in high school described this to me was a baker. If a baker opens a new bakery and doesn't know how much bread to make, he's got to start somewhere. So he bakes as much bread as what he thinks he'll need. Well, the next day, within 2 hours of opening, he sells out of bread. So he realizes, hey, I need to make more bread. So the next night, he makes more bread. Well, the next day, his bread lasts a little longer, but he still sells out before he closes the store. So he continues this process until eventually, at the end of the day, there's a little bread left over. And that's the invisible hand that Adam Smith believed in. Adam Smith also believed that borrowing money was okay in hard economic times, but during good times, the debt should be paid down as fast as possible. And this is when the United States jumped on the Adam Smith train. The federal government ultimately took responsibility for national and state debt, which was huge for states because many were having trouble paying down their debts. Many of them lacked ports, which was one way they could create revenue to pay back their debts by extracting tariffs from imported goods. In 1835, we conquered the debt. And one way that we conquered the debt was that debt was paid during good times, cutting spending, and ultimately President Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson didn't like the thought of paying for something by borrowing. He thought that it was immoral. Politicians debated on how fast to pay back their loans, but Jackson was stern and said, "We will pay the debt back as fast as possible." Now, how did he pay back the debt? He paid the debt by selling government-owned land in the West to settlers, which ended in huge amounts of surplus, which became known as the land bubble. While Jackson tried to slow this down by requiring land to be bought by gold and silver, he couldn't slow it down, and this ended in a 6-year depression that ended in more borrowing. Now let's jump ahead 100 years to what I like to refer to as the irresponsible era. During World War II, the national debt rose from $48 billion to $269 billion. The GDP was 121% of the national debt. But unlike in the past, our government elected not to pay down the debt after the war. They were going to try to limit spending, not allow the debt to rise to an astronomical number, and let our economy grow, thus dropping the GDP. And ultimately this worked, and 10 years later, in 1960, the national debt only grew 6% to $286 billion, while the GDP more than doubled from $222 billion to $518 billion. The GDP dropped 57%. Now what the country is doing is another economist theory, John Keynes. Keynes felt that a national debt was not like a personal debt because the government owed the money to its own citizens. So Keynes reasoned it was like one family member owing money to another. The net worth of the family is unchanged. So I don't know about you, but if my brother ever stole money from me, I never saw it again. And the net worth of the family was changed. Now let's jump ahead to the 80s, where the United States takes Keynes' look on spending to a new extreme. President Reagan wants tax cuts and increased spending in military. Congress obliges, but they want spending in other places. And ultimately, everyone is made happy, and we just borrowed the money and kept spending. By the end of the decade, the national debt more than tripled from $909 billion to $3.2 trillion. Now the 90s, the spending trend continues. In 1995, the government overspent by $192 billion. Now think back to before World War II. The national debt was only $48 billion. We have now spent 4 times that in 1 year. And by the end of 1995, the national debt was nearly $5 trillion. Now there is light at the end of the decade. In 1998, we had the first fiscal year of spending in surplus since 1969. And from 1998 until 2001 was the first time we had 4 surplus spending years consecutively in nearly half a century. Now let's jump ahead to the 21st century, where I feel that the borrowing game is nearing its end. In 2001, GDP is 56%. In 2008, In 2001, GDP is 56%, merely 1% less than what it was after World War II. During President Bush's 8 years in office, he spent $4.899 trillion during his 8-year term. That is what the national debt was in 1995. So in 8 years, he more than doubled what the national debt was in 95. Now in 2008, I'm sure many of you are aware that President Obama was elected. And in the year that he was elected in 2008, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the crash of 2008. Where the GDP rose to 102%, which is only the second time in history where the GDP was over 100%, if you can recall, after World War II. Now let's talk about Social Security. And why do I want to talk about Social Security when it has its own separate account from the general fund, and many of us pay this in payroll tax? I want to talk about it because as of 2010, there's less being paid into Social Security than what is being taken out already. And in 2011, the first wave of baby boomers retired. The amount of people enrolled in Medicare will grow from 47 million to 80 million people. Enrollment in Social Security will rise from 43 million to 73 million, while the number paying into these programs will drop. So where does the money come from? Or are we just left off the hook? Now let's jump to where we are now, 2012. $16 trillion in debt. In March of 2012, the government spending hit $4.939 trillion in the 3 years and 2 months since the 2008 election, and the GDP is steadily above 100%. As of August 2012, the U.S. Treasury Department has spent $343 billion in interest payments to the national debt holders. $343 billion, and we didn't even cut down the deficit. Compare that to NASA at $21 billion. I'm sure many of you living in the Space Coast were affected by the cuts made to NASA. The Department of Education at $60 billion. The Department of Transportation at $70 billion. I don't know, but I think that the spending game is nearing its end. I'd like to thank you all for listening. And as we bring this train to a halt, I hope you all have a better understanding of the United States and its national debt. Hopefully the next conversation you have with someone about the national debt, you'll be able to recall and restate a few facts that you've learned today.